Okay, here we
Piece
go.
of cake. Oh.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon, and on behalf of the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies, I welcome you to another session in the 6-part series of our annual seminar. This seminar is funded by the Paul Peck Humanities Institute at Montgomery College, and it is tailored to provide professional development for the faculty from Montgomery College and at all the campuses that make up the college in Maryland. Each year, a committee selects faculty members to pursue their own research within a prescribed theme. The SI Fellows, such as all of you around the table here today, study together in a seminar setting, like what we have here today, with Smithsonian researchers, curators, and educators. And at the end of the series, each fellow produces a research-based project that benefits the education community. The faculty members bring their students or encourage them to come to the Smithsonian. And for the Smithsonian, this partnership is a fulfillment of the original mandate, the increase and diffusion of knowledge. This is the 10th year of the seminar, and each year it is growing in stature to become a meaningful educational project here at the Smithsonian. I would like to thank Judy Gaines, the director of Paul Peck Humanities Institute, and Usha Venkatesh, coordinator of the project at Montgomery College, Professor Venkatesh, and I thank them for their continued support and encouragement. And that's how we have been alive for the last 10 years and growing. This year and each year we develop a different theme, and the 6 sessions that we planned take us to different parts of the institution. And for this year, the theme is the politics, poetics, and promise of collecting, the responsibility of museums. And the sessions that have been planned to convey the rich diversity here at the Smithsonian. For our first session, titled The Museum Without Walls, which was at the Cultural Resources Center, part of the National Museum of the American Indian. And through the expertise of Jim Pepper Henry and John Beaver, curators and conservators, we learned about the challenges of managing one of the largest collections in the world of Native American ethnographic and archaeological materials. For our second session, we visited the newly reopened, after a 6.5-year extensive renovation, the National Portrait Gallery and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. We toured the greatly talked about Launder Conservation Center with Julie Heath, and also learned about the Luch Foundation Center. The discussions with Director Mark Pachter, curators Ellen Miles and George Gurney, and educators Brianna Zavadil-White, Susanna Nippold, who all addressed issues of collections, conservation, storage, and the reinvigorated exhibitions that now are part of the Portrait Gallery and the American Art Museum. Now, last week, we were with Harry Rubenstein, curator and chair in the Division of Politics and Reform at the National Museum of American History, which is, although closed to the public, but we had quite an interesting tour up to the conference room, where Harry addressed in his important topic of creating exhibits that matter. We discussed the problems of censorship, funding, social and political pressures that curators face in mounting exhibitions. And next week, with Dr. Richard Curran, director of the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, we will see and learn about a famous and treasured object at the Smithsonian, the Hope Diamond. And also in that session titled Museuming Through Intangible to Tangible, Dr. Atesh Sonneborn will talk about the Folkways collection And this is a precious collection, and not much is known about it, which is very important in the music world. Finally, on April 26th, we will go to the Stephen Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia, also known as the National Air and Space Extension. There, our education director, Doug Baldwin, will take us on a walk through America's hangar. So we've got a lot of excitement still to come. But for our session today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Lonnie Bunch, founding director of the newly established National Museum of African American History and Culture. He is the most qualified, most experienced person for this session, entitled Museums and the Politics of Race. Lonnie is a distinguished historian, a passionate educator, a skilled administrator, and a gifted fundraiser, and believe me, that's very important today. A scholar, and above all, a mentor for many, not only here at the institution, but for all those who come across his way, and that includes myself. Before taking this position, Lonnie served as president of the Chicago Historical Society. He was the first African American in that position. In his previous incarnation, Lonnie held several positions at the Smithsonian Institution. He served as an educational specialist historian at the National Air and Space Museum, and later served as the assistant director for curatorial affairs at the National Museum of American History. While at that museum, he had oversight of several divisions, including community life. He worked on the exhibition American Presidency, A Glorious Burden, which we have done several visits with our fellows from Montgomery College. He developed Smithsonian's America for the American Festival in Japan, and that was from 1992 to 1994. And in between these two positions, Lonnie served as the curator of history at the California Afro-American Museum in Los Angeles. There, he organized several award-winning exhibitions, including the Black Olympians, 1904 to 1984, and the Black Angelinos, the Afro-American in Los Angeles, 1850 to 1950. Lonnie has produced several historical documentaries for public television. He has held several teaching positions as professor of American and Afro-American history at the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth, and as an adjunct professor of museum studies at the George Washington University from 1989 to 2000. In addition to all that, Lonnie is a prolific and widely published author. He has written on a range of subjects, from Black military history, the American presidency, and all Black towns in the American West, to diversity in museum management and the impact of funding and politics on American museums. Now that's a hot, greatly debated topic here at the institution and outside. Lonnie serves on several advisory boards, including the American Association of Museums and the American Association of State and Local History. Lonnie said it gives him great pride to be on the Commission on the Preservation of the White House. With that brilliant track record, we are fortunate to have Lonnie back with us again for a critically important, challenging, and in many ways promising position. But he himself has called it the hardest job he will ever have. Please join me. And Lonnie, we thank you for sparing the time to be with us.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. Thank you very much. I'm always struck when I hear this kind introduction. She sort of listed everything that I've ever done except the fact that I was president of my third grade class 2 years in a row. See, there's hope for everybody, see? Today I want to sort of avoid the real challenge of doing what all historians do. There's nothing more dangerous than giving us a captive audience and a microphone. But what I'd like to try to do today is talk a little bit about the challenge of building a national museum, and then frame it by discussing really the sort of, if you will, the state of the art when it comes to interpreting race in American museums. What we've done well and what we've done less well, and then sort of open it up for us to have a conversation about it. But you know, one of the joys of being a historian, especially as I now feel, as my daughter said, old, is that there are a lot of wonderful stories I can share. And let me share one that means a great deal to me that helps to frame this conversation. Early in my career at the Smithsonian, I was working on a major exhibition on the 19th century, with Harry Rubenstein, in fact, and one of the aspects of that show was going to look at slavery. And I decided that I wanted to look at slavery not in a standard way, but really through the lens of a single plantation. So I traveled all around the country looking at plantations. I was at cotton plantations in Texas and Alabama. I looked at tobacco plantations in North Carolina, amazing sugar plantations in Louisiana. But I found the plantation that I wanted to focus on by going to a place called the Waccamaw Neck outside of Georgetown, South Carolina. And this was an amazing rice plantation. It was the old Friendfield plantation. And when I, being a good Washingtonian, drive off this highway onto this amazingly muddy dirt road, I'm thinking this may not be the place for me. But I turn the corner, and suddenly there were 10 slave cabins from the 19th century still extant, still standing as if it was the 1850s. And next to one of those cabins was a man, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson was 90 years old and had lived in the cabin with his slave grandmother. You could imagine, for a historian, this is the Holy Grail. This is somebody that's going to be able to tell you how this cabin existed in the lives of slaves. So Mr. Johnson was wonderful. He took me to the front of the cabin, and he talked for 20 minutes how slaves like his grandmother used a broom to sweep the ground so that it became almost hard as concrete, so there'd be no grass, so there'd be no vermin, and so that slaves could extend their living space into having a front yard. He took me to one side, and he talked about the role that the children played in watching the chimney to make sure it didn't catch on fire when they cooked or didn't fall down. And then he got quiet, and he took me to the back, and he talked about how important it was for the enslaved to be able to grow food in the back of the cabin, to supplement not only what the master gave them, but in some ways to be able to sell it to make money, to have more control over their lives. And then we went to the fourth side, or rather I went. He didn't come. I said, Mr. Johnson, what happened over here? He said, son, I'm not going over there. I said, Mr. Johnson, please, what happened over here? He said, I'm not going over there. So I said to him, listen, excuse me, sir, you may have forgotten. I've come all the way from Washington, D.C. Help me out. What happened over here? He said, I'm not going. I finally said, Mr. Johnson, please, why not? He said, because there are nothing but rattlesnakes over there. Now, after I stopped running, I asked Mr. Johnson, I said, Mr. Johnson, why didn't you tell me about the rattlesnakes? And he said, everybody used to remember, but people seem to have forgotten. He said, if you're really a historian, your job is simple. You need to find ways to help people to remember, but remember not just what they want, but help them remember to what they need. And so in some ways, crafting a National Museum of African American History and Culture is really about something very simple, helping people to remember, but helping them to remember what they need, not just what they want. And in some ways, the challenge of remembering African American culture on the National Mall has been almost 100 years in the making. I mean, the idea of this museum is not new. The idea first really came around 1913. And many of you remember, 1913 was the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And we've all seen those pictures of sort of graying men in blue and gray shaking hands saying the war is over, we're together as a country again. But if you look at those pictures, you never see African Americans in those pictures. So many of the black soldiers who had served in the Civil War, almost 200,000, said, why not us? And as a result of all that activity about Gettysburg, they decided to sort of try to create an organization to create a national monument on the mall. So there was legislation introduced, and fundraising done to create a monument for black soldiers on the Mall in 1916. Unfortunately, 1917, World War I breaks out, more attention to that, the monument goes away. But the idea of creating this monument doesn't die. And in fact, Calvin Coolidge, who we tend to forget about, actually signed legislation to create a national museum on the Mall. And there was great excitement, great fundraising. Unfortunately, the Depression came. Obviously, not a priority. This idea lied fallow until really 1968. When Martin Luther King is assassinated, there is this great desire to remember Martin Luther King and to memorialize him. And ultimately, that's led to a memorial that's going to be open soon. But that, again, the idea of a museum died. And throughout the 80s and early 90s, there were attempts to create a national museum. But what really led this to happen was there was the realization in the 90s that suddenly many of the members of the civil rights generation, people who had helped to transform America, were aging and dying. And there was this real desire. So suddenly people, initially Mickey Leland of Texas, but then John Lewis, one of the great heroes of the civil rights movement, sort of created a bipartisan effort to create this museum that President George Bush signed into law in 2003. And what's important is to recognize why now. I think first of all, why now is that you really have a bipartisan effort for really the first time. You have a lot of people on both sides of the aisle recognizing that this is a story that is a central story, an important story, an essential story for all of us. But you also have, thanks to wonderful people, scholars like John Hope Franklin, you've got 40, 50 years of real scholarship. You remember, the Smithsonian is driven by scholarship. Scholarship is the engine of all we do. So to be able to say that there are now 3 or 4 generations of brilliant scholarship around questions of race really meant that there was no reason why this couldn't happen. But you also had a thriving middle class, black and non-black, who recognized that this was a story that was important to them. Whether it was their involvement in the civil rights movement or their own interaction during their time in the military, but there suddenly is a large group of people who said, hey, I want to know more about this story. And then, quite honestly, there's money. There are an array of people who are interested in supporting this kind of institution. So the notion of now saying, finally, after almost 100 years, we now have everything in place to craft the National Museum has really led us to this moment where we are now. But I think the challenge is to figure out, all right, what is this thing? What is this National Museum of African American History and Culture? One of the things I'd love to be able to do is figure out a shorter name. So if you've got some ideas, I'll take that. But I mean, I think that if you try to define what this museum should be, you've got to think where we are today. What should this museum be in the 21st century? Well, first of all, it really has to be a museum that harkens back to Mr. Johnson. It has to be a museum that helps you remember. It has to be a museum that almost gives you an insider's view of African American culture. It should allow you to dip deep into the reservoir of this history, of this culture, to understand it. So you should be able to go to a museum like this and really grapple with difficult questions like slavery. Grapple with the challenge of desegregation and Jim Crow in America. Wrestle with the implications and the continuing resonance of the civil rights movement. Look at America when there were moments of great evil, moments of great disappointment, moments of great tragedy. But in some ways, that is only a part of the story, because this is also a story of the joy that comes out of African American culture. It is the story that if you walk into this building, I do want you to cry from time to time, but I also want you to tap your toe to Louis Armstrong or Duke Ellington or Aretha Franklin or somebody from hip-hop who I have no idea who it is, but my daughters do. I want you to be able to find the joy that is incumbent in an African American community. So I want you to understand the role of Jesse Owens or Muhammad Ali. But I also want you to remember the nameless enslaved woman who got up every day and fed her children before she went in the fields, and who came home every night making sure that the field didn't break her of her humor or her humanity. Or I want you to remember the family that left southern Mississippi for the south side of Chicago in 1943, believing that there was a better day. But I also want you to remember the woman that stayed in the South and after 70 years finally got the vote for the first time in 1968. So I want you to be able to see the richness of this experience. But I also want you to walk into a museum that helps you understand that it's not simply an American experience. It is an international story. That in some ways, we as Americans, we don't do well grappling with global issues. We're real comfortable sometimes within our shores. But the story of Black America is the story of Africa, Europe, Brazil, Latin America. It is a story that says, here is a way to help all Americans see how they are connected globally. So we want that to happen. And so ultimately, I want you to be able to feel the richness of this culture. I want you to be able to come out and say, boy, there were things I didn't know, there were things that I now understand, but I really now have an insider's perspective. But I have to be honest. If that's all a National Museum does, I would suggest to you it's less than successful. Because I think a National Museum also has to take African American culture and make it this lens that helps us understand what it means to be an American. I would suggest to you that African American culture is in some ways the quintessential American culture. It is a wonderful lens that helps us understand our identity. It helps us understand our notions of who we are. I mean, think about it. I'm always struck when people say to me, what are core American values? And when I look at those values, the values that I care about, of resiliency, of optimism, of spirituality, we're better than the African American community to look at that, to look at the roots of that. And when I try to figure out who we are as Americans, when we talk about the power of liberty and equality in America, we're better to understand both the promise of that and the limits of that promise than the African American experience. So in some ways, this is the American story. This has to be a museum that says, regardless of whether your family came here in the 1820s, in the 1920s, or 20 minutes ago, you will realize that you are shaped in profound and important ways by the African American experience. So that in essence, it is important to recognize this is not an African American museum for African Americans. This is the quintessential American museum that says, this is your story. This is the best way you can understand who you are, by embracing, by understanding, by grappling with difficult moments and grappling with moments of great solace and moments of great levity. But I would also suggest that part of what a 21st century museum has to be is to really be something that's outside of Washington. It has to really be a place of collaboration. Now, museums talk about collaboration all the time, and we do it miserably. But we swear we do it. But what we've said here is that collaboration is not something we do. Collaboration is who we are. That in essence, what we've said is that the Smithsonian has to realize that sometimes we think, we at the Smithsonian, rightly or wrongly, sometimes we think we're the ship and all else is the sea. And what we've realized is there are hundreds of institutions, thousands of individuals globally who have wrestled with these questions, who care about this. So let us not pretend we're the only ones. Let us find ways to reach out, to work collaboratively so that we all benefit. So in essence, what we want to be is maybe a beacon that brings people to Washington. Because as you know, there are millions of people that will come to the Smithsonian that won't go to other museums. We want to bring you to Washington, and we want you to revel with the stories, look at the artifacts. But then what we want to do is push you back to the local community. So therefore, if you come to see an exhibition on the migration of blacks from the South to the North, we might set up things virtually and actually that after you go through the exhibition, we say, if you're from the West Coast, go to the California African American Museum to see how migration plays out in Los Angeles. Or go to the Chicago Historical Society and see how it plays out in Chicago. In essence, what we will do is say, we will tell a national story, but we will encourage you to go local, to go back to the communities. And if we do that, what that really allows us is, first of all, it allows us to really be a national institution. A national institution ought to be a place that says, we are a way into the story, but there are other places where you can go and tell and understand that story. So we think collaboration is essential to who we are. And I think that we will judge our success in part by how our activities improves everybody, improves African American institutions, improves museums that care about history, improves museums that explore culture in interesting ways. So it seems to me that the challenge for us is to really try to be an institution that, quite candidly, is worthy and equal to the wonders of the Smithsonian, to be a great museum on the mall. But I would argue it also has the obligation to be a museum that is worthy not just of the Smithsonian, but worthy of the sacrifices, worthy of the richness, worthy of the important legacy of African American culture. So in essence, we serve two masters. We want to be the best of the Smithsonian. We also want to recognize that we have a lot of people who we want to remember and a lot of people whose shoulders we stand upon. So we want this museum to be that kind of rich experience as well. So if you say to me, all right, you've got an idea of roughly what you want this museum to be, but how important is this really? Somebody once asked me that after a speech. I said, okay, you gave a really nice speech, but is this really that important? Well, after I restrained my New Jersey upbringing and didn't reach over and grab the person, what I realized is that why this is important is because in some ways I think there is nothing more powerful than a nation that remembers. And that often we forget African American culture when we struggle to remember. And we forget that African American culture is American culture. So for me, as we struggle not only with race in America, but as we struggle with our own national identity, as we struggle with who we are in the 21st century, I think there is nothing more important than for us to be able to see how this culture, this history, shapes who we are in profound and important ways. And I would think that in many ways, what I think African American culture does, and I've written about this a lot, is that it really is this amazingly unforgiving mirror. This mirror that reminds us of our ideals, reminds us of what we've promised, it reminds us of what we've accomplished, but it also challenges us to live up to what we say we are as Americans. And it challenges us to realize that so much of African American culture is also about common ground, about people working across lines, working across boundaries. In some ways, this is important because if we do it right, we'll help people find their better selves. And in some ways, our goal is simple to say and hard to do. Our goal is really to hearken back to something that a great historian said early in his career, Carter G. Woodson. This is the guy that created Negro History Week and ultimately Black History Month. When Woodson was really at the end of his career, he lived in Washington, D.C., this is a man that basically gave his whole life to history. A reporter asked him, they said, you know, after all this that you've given, is it worth it? Why do you do this? And Dr. Woodson looked at this reporter incredulously and said, I do history for one reason and one reason only, to make America better. And in some ways, that's ultimately the tagline of the National Museum. Our goal is to be a great museum, but our goal is to recognize that if we can help Americans grapple and wrestle with race, we can help to make America better. As we say in Chicago, make no little plans. And so for us, The goal is to really try to be the kind of institution that is a change agent, that allows us to find reconciliation and healing. So ultimately, that's sort of what we're trying to do. But quite honestly, it's an amazing challenge. And I'd like to share with you just some of the challenges of trying to craft a national museum. When I came, I had, one staff person, no site, no building, no collections, not a whole lot of friends on the Hill, a lot of people who told me what I should be doing. And when I got here, I realized that at 8 o'clock in the morning, this is the best job in the world. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. And in a way, the challenge of crafting a national museum is difficult regardless of what the museum is. But now layer on race. And suddenly you begin to realize that this requires a astuteness, a sense of strategy, a political acumen that, thank God, I've got wonderful staffers who can help me figure all this stuff out. But I think that when you look at the challenge of crafting a museum, there are several that quickly come to mind. I mean, just think about it conceptually. Trying to figure out, what stories do you tell? Think about it. If you build a museum the size of the National Museum of the American Indian, for example, well, let's say you have room to tell 9 or 10 stories. Okay. If you begin to think of all American history and the African American experience, and I said to you, what are the 10 stories you tell? How do you figure that out? So you might say, okay, no problem. You know you got to tell the story of slavery, right? Okay. You know you need to tell the story of the Civil Rights Movement. You probably need to tell the story of Jim Crow segregation somehow. You probably need to tell the story of music. Maybe tell the story of sports. Do you tell the story of the military experience? Do you tell the story of migration? I mean, suddenly you realize that if you only have a limited opportunity, how do you give the public the stories they need to know? What are those fundamental stories? And I think what's really interesting to me is to think about not only what are the stories, but remember, this is not simply a museum of history. It's a museum of culture. So, what does that tell us about theater and literature? What does it tell us about education? So in some ways, one of the challenges is to figure out how can you be a museum that gives people a broad enough sweep, but doesn't fall into the trap of being encyclopedic. Because no matter what we say, we're not a book on the wall. And then add to that, how do you tell those stories? How do you tell stories that engage youth? How do you tell difficult stories about race when people think that the civil rights movement is 5 generations ago? How do you utilize technology in an appropriate way so that in some ways, think about it, you're at the Smithsonian. That means you can't be simply a place of pushing buttons. Even if you have the best technology ever, you're surrounded in a place where there is the authentic. People will see the Greensboro lunch counter. They'll see the Wright flyer. They'll see the Hope Diamond. And if all you have are buttons, you're not going to compete. So the challenge is, how do you find that tension between being a place of artifacts and of tradition and a place of technology and innovation? So all of that becomes sort of this wonderfully interesting challenge. And then add to it the things we said. How do we make it a museum for all Americans? And how do we really make it a place that can stimulate reconciliation and healing? So it suddenly means thinking about how we get to this, how we work with scholars, how we work with educators, how we understand what our audience needs, how we, as Oprah Winfrey always tells me, how do you make sure you tell effective stories? Storytelling in some ways is going to be at the heart of the success of this museum. But how do you do that? So in some ways, I think that's one of the challenges. But another challenge really is this question of how do you reach the broad audience that you want to reach? Think about it. People say to me all the time, they say, well, you could use the Holocaust Museum as a model. Well, this is not simply a story, while slavery may be a horrible story, it's not simply a story of difficult moments. But the Holocaust model is instructive because in some ways, the Holocaust Museum has done brilliant things. It has allowed us to humanize difficult stories, which I think is something we want to learn from. It's also allowed us to believe you can tell very difficult stories. But the difference is that in the Holocaust Museum, the bad people aren't Americans. And one of the real challenges is we Americans don't do being bad well. And to be able to sort of figure out how do you explore those moments of great evil, those moments of great difficulty that we've done. One of the things that I was struck by my time in Chicago is we did a major exhibition looking at lynching. And that's just, you can't get more difficult than that. Horrible images. And when we decided to do it, my staff said, we really can't do this. There's got to be a way. People are going to come after us. And I said, well, one of the things in Chicago that is very powerful to me was the way Chicago has always remembered the murder of Emmett Till. You may remember Emmett Till was that 15-year-old teenager who was killed in 1955, and his mother was a dear friend of mine. And Chicago every year would pause and think about what that meant. So I said, well, why don't we use the story of lynching and racial violence, taking it through Emmett Till, as a way to begin to people to see that this is not just abstract, faceless people, but really this is about individual loss and what it means to families. And what struck me is when the city of Chicago got very excited about it, it said to me, we can do that. But the most difficult thing people had was coming to grips with the fact that on many of those lynching pictures, there are people smiling, pointing, people coming as if it's a carnival and a festival. And it taught me, because people had such a hard time with that if we're going to talk about difficult issues where Americans are the people who have caused the difficult moments, that's going to be a real challenge for us. So we have to think about how do we intellectually do that, and how do we do it in a way that people can come to this museum and learn, be challenged, be stimulated, but not come to it as if you're coming to take castor oil. And I think trying to find that balance is going to be an interesting challenge for us. And then, as somebody said, if you're going to build a national museum today, one of the big challenges is fundraising. When I told my mother I was going to take this job, I thought her first reaction was going to say, oh, I'm so proud of you. Her first reaction was, are you crazy? You're going to have to raise more money than God can count. And I remember thinking, ooh, she's right. And one of the challenges is to be able to find the resources, not just to build an institution, but to also provide the kind of endowments that allow us to do the kind of flexible, curious work that we really want to do. And I think that figuring out how to find this money, because if you've looked at the legislation, 50% of the cost of the construction of the building will be borne by Congress, and 50% will come from the private sector. So that means that a lot of my job is both finding the people on the private side who will write the checks, but also part of my job is, I won't say managing, let's say working effectively with Congress. So that therefore part of the challenge, as you know, is with all the issues that face us, war and the beginning of recessions and housing slowdowns, the challenge of making sure that this institution receives the attention it needs in a timely fashion from Congress is one of the big challenges. So really wrestling with how do you make sure you've got the resources you need is one of the great joys that I have. And it is wonderful because, quite honestly, there's so many people on the Hill and off the Hill that are very excited about this. And I give you one small example. As you could imagine, I'm traveling a lot, both fundraising, telling people about the museum, working with other institutions. And I was in, and I don't remember what city. It was either Dallas or Minneapolis. I can't remember. But I was in one, little different. I don't remember. But I was there, and I was doing my one. I only have one superstition. When I fly, I get my shoe shined because a plane will never crash as long as my shoes are shined. Just my way of thinking. And so I was getting my shoe shined, and the guy who was shining my shoes, after I finished, he said to me, "Aren't you the guy from that museum? I just saw your picture in the paper." I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I hear you're building." I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Well, I'll tell you what I want you to do. The $5 you just gave me for the shoe shine, would you please take it back and contribute it to the museum?" And I said, "Wait a minute. I mean, keep that. You're working really hard." And he said, "No, I want you to realize that all of us have a stake in this museum. I'm not Oprah Winfrey," he said, "but I'm somebody that can help in any way I can." And that kind of passion I get around the country. So what it does is first of all, it humbles you. It makes you realize what you have in your hands. But what it really does is help you realize that now is the time, that there is great interest, great passion for this. But I think if you said to me, what's one of the real challenges of building this museum? I'll tell you what it is. You have all you've been to American history, you're going out there in space, you're going to places where you can see things, engage with artifacts. Richard Kieran's going to talk to you about the Hope Diamond. You're all going to go see the Hope Diamond. And what I'm doing, however, is I'm selling a dream. I'm building a dream. And in some ways, one of the challenges is, how do you build a dream? How do you get people to realize, one, it's going to happen, and now's the time for you to support? And how do you make it both passionate and important, but also practical, so you can get it done? So I think the challenge of building a dream is that even the best dream needs somebody to implement it and make it real. And so part of our challenge is, and I've been very fortunate to bring on some amazingly gifted staff who allow me to paint the dream, and they build the ladder to get us to the promised land. But I think that challenge of making a dream reality is really one of the issues. And I guess for me, I was really surprised when it was announced that I was going to take this job, how many friends I had who were architects. I am stunned at the number of people who have known me for years who suddenly say, "I can build your building." And even before, the day this job was announced, I was still in Chicago, and I wasn't even at home. And I came back from a trip, and there were 8 packages on my doorstep from architects. I hadn't even said I was going to take the job. And so one of the challenges, actually building this building. How do you, first of all, the fact that we have one of the most amazing sites in Washington, on the Mall, at the corner of 14th and 15th and Constitution, or as my staff likes to say, we are at the intersection of the Constitution and the 14th and 15th Amendment, just down the road from the 13th Amendment. And so for us, this is a special place. But imagine the challenge of building on the Mall. Oh, there are a myriad of regulatory agencies, but think about, what do you build? What does the building look like? There are people who say to me, "Oh, does the building look like Africa? Does the building look like African American?" I don't know what African American looks like. What does the building look like? And then the challenge of, who builds the building? Is it American? Is it an African American? Is it somebody from Europe? Is it a combination? So thinking about a process that allows us to really have the kind of wonderful competition that would allow great creativity when it comes to building this institution, and figuring out what building is worthy of the Mall, but is also innovative enough to say, this is the place where you can come. So I think building a building is one of the great challenges. 2 other challenges that really give me pause. People ask me, what keeps you up at night? Raising a lot of money, that's a worry at about 2 in the afternoon. That's not an in the middle of the night worry. A middle of the night worry is building a collection. When the Indian Museum was built, one of the things it had were hundreds of thousands of artifacts. so that there were things you could easily choose from and build. So that this institution, while we will benefit from some of the things many of us have collected at the Smithsonian throughout our tenure, it also has to build its own collection. And so think about it. If this were 30 years ago, there were things that you could acquire that people would give you, but now in the post-eBay world, everything has a value. And people who would once give collections now say, that's going to pay for my grandkids to go to college. So suddenly there are the challenge of finding collections in a way that's reasonable. Many people quickly call me and say, you're by my collection. We are the goose with the golden egg. And so one of the challenges for us is, how do you build a collection today? Well, one of the ways to do it is something that we're going to really push over the next several years, and that is a national collecting initiative, a kind of save our African American treasures. Because we believe strongly that the 20th century and a bit of the 19th century is still in everybody's attics, basements, garage. My mother's probably got at least half the 19th century in her basement. And so our goal is to create this national initiative where we work collaboratively with regional institutions. And by working with those institutions, we're able to sort of help people preserve things in their homes, maybe encourage people to give to local museums. If we're in Chicago, give to the Chicago Historical Society or the DuSable Museum. And then a small percentage might come back to the Smithsonian. But that's part of the way to begin to build our collections. And then obviously to work with people who have collections and to say, well, you know what? Traditionally people say to you, give the whole collection. I'm not greedy. I'll just take a piece of it. So really the key is to try to create non-traditional ways to really find and build the collections. But ultimately, I would argue that the biggest challenge that anybody has crafting a national museum is building a leadership team, is creating a staff that has your values, but that recognizes that on the one hand, the goal is to be a Smithsonian Institution museum, but to also recognize you're in a startup mode. So when I was at American History, if I had an idea, there were at least 60, 70 people I could say, play around with that idea. We don't have that now. So the real challenge is to find really gifted people who are comfortable with ambiguity. Because if you're going to build a new institution in the startup mode, you better be comfortable with ambiguity. If you come in and say, I'm a curator, I can only do this, or I'm an educator, I can only do that, it's a hard place for you to be. And so I think building a team that is comfortable with ambiguity, but that is comfortable with the values that simply say, this is a museum that's going to be, as I've said, the hardest thing we've ever done, but it's also the most important thing you're going to do. And therefore, I want it done in a certain way. I don't want, how can I say this in the right way? I don't want prima donnas. I want people who recognize this is about ancestors, not us. And so really trying to find those people and getting the staff that we need is one of the great challenges. So in some ways, building a national museum has a whole lot of issues, some of which are very similar to when they built the Museum of American History in 1964, or when the Indian Museum went up 3 years ago. Others are fundamentally different, that are really uncharted ground for us. And what makes this, I think, so important is when you look at the state of the interpretation of race in American museums. Because I think in some ways this means that we have a very significant role to play. And let me just talk briefly about what I think is the state. When you look around the country, no one can deny that the days when African American culture, for example, was invisible, those days are gone. I remember early in my career, there was an institution that did aviation history, and they were criticized for not having a black presence. And so they asked a few people to come up with ideas of how to improve the black presence. and this would have been in the 70s. And when curators came with ideas, they were told, no, that's not what we're talking about. What we'd really like is to be able to make a mannequin of your figure and put it in the airplanes so there'd be a black presence. Now, and that's a true story, the day of African American history on the fringe is gone. You're no longer in the back in airplanes that no one can see unless they buy cheap binoculars. But I would argue there has been wonderful moments to celebrate, and the Smithsonian has played a major role in that. There have been amazing exhibitions, like Spencer Cruz from Field to Factory that looked at migration of blacks from the South to the North. There's new work at the New York Historical Society looking at slavery in New York. There are almost every major institution has explored some aspect of African American history, whether it's the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan or the California African American Museum in LA or the Louisiana State Museum. Everybody has said there's a piece of this story they will tell. And what's even more impressive is even small institutions have done this. The Geneva County Historical Society in upstate New York has done amazing work. The Nicholas von Herkimer House in Little Falls, New York, has done amazing work looking at questions of race. So on the one hand, many of my colleagues have said to me, when it comes to African American culture, when it comes to race, museums have really done a good job. And I would argue to you that while African American culture is no longer invisible, I would suggest that it's really still too soon for us to kind of rest on our laurels, to say, because we've had a Field to Factory, enough has been done. I would suggest to you that there are really sort of 4 issues that shape the way we interpret history, interpret African American culture, that mean our job is not done, that there's still so much more to do. I would suggest to you that African American history is no longer invisible, but I still think it's being interpreted as if it's the 1950s. In some way, when you go to museums around the country, when you look at what they do with African American history, they basically say African Americans are here too. In other words, it's really the desire to do the African American in Los Angeles or a black artist in this. There's a desire to sort of say these stories are important, but they're not presented in a way that I think helps us today. They're not stories that explore interaction, conflict, cultural borrowing. In some ways, they're depicted as simple, static stories, that it's enough to say, they exist too. And when you look at this, I think there are a couple of real challenges. One is most of the museums in this country fail to what I call transcend the rosy glow of history. If you look at most of what's in these museums, it is a series of positive images and famous firsts. It's a series of saying that these are heroic stories. I'm always struck by Langston Hughes, who I just love, and one of his poems that said, life for me ain't no crystal scare. It's full of, nails and torn rugs. And it suggests that somehow, as you look at culture is not a linear path to progress. And yet, in the way history is depicted, especially African American history, in many of these museums, it's as if progress, freedom, equality was inevitable. All you had to do was have patience, that eventually it was all going to open up for you. And I would suggest that one of the challenges for museums is to not just wrestle with difficult stories. I'm not encouraging people to only do lynching or only do, the sort of anus power of discrimination. But what I'm saying is that in some ways, unless we give the public a real understanding of what African American culture is, moments of real tragedy, moments of defeat, as well as moments of victory, only by then will you really understand what the story is we're telling. Only then will you really understand how heroic this story is in some ways. But I also think that when you look at African American culture, one of the things that is crucially important is to realize that, and I say this in a way that's maybe a little harsh, But ultimately, when I go to museums, I think that African American culture is usually segregated from other stories. In some ways, as I like to say, Jim Crow is alive and well in American museums. You can go, one of the things I was so struck by, I was in a museum in the South looking at a history of slavery. And in a history of slavery, there was no mention of anybody non-African American. There was no mention, not just of owners and overseers, but no mention that slavery was the economic engine for the Industrial Revolution. No mention that slavery is not simply an African American story, but it's a quintessential American story. You all know that slavery, we were the OPEC of the 19th century when it came to cotton. You know how slavery really did lead to the growth of Bristol, Rhode Island, and shape the industrial growth of New York and all the banks. Nowhere do you see that. It's almost as if it's a separate story. And while I recognize the need to tell the story of black musicians in Memphis, Tennessee, and the story of Black Boston, what I think is missing is a desire to help us understand that these stories all interact and interconnect, that these are not Jim Crow separate stories, but rather that the story is how what affects one affects the other, how sometimes one group wins as other groups lose. But it really is important to create a more realistic way of saying it's not enough to simply say and isolate a story. And that's why, even though this museum is called the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that's why it's so important for us to make sure that one of the lenses that we look through is the quintessential American lens, is to say this is the American story for all of us. Because I think that's what's missing in so many museums. I also think that when I look at museums, one of the things that's missing is really helping people see that, and this is funny considering what history is, but to see how things change. Often we take such small snapshots, and I've been guilty of it. When I did the show on the 19th century in American history, I looked at this rice plantation from about 1830 to 1850. Instead of letting people see that slavery in the 19th century is different than slavery in the 18th century, or slavery in Charleston is different than slavery in Louisiana. And in some ways, we have to overcome the notion of creating this static history that simply says, we've given you a snapshot, rather than help people see how dynamic it is, how much history changes over time. And I guess I would suggest that one of the other real challenges of interpreting African American history is to go beyond a middle-class lens. Often what we do is tell middle-class stories, partly because those are the artifacts we have, partly because those are the stories of heroes and victory. But the story of the middle class, throughout most of its history, the middle class was a small percentage of all Americans. And so you're really not telling a complete story if you focus simply on a middle-class community. So in some ways, the challenge for us is to really create a more dynamic African-American interpretation, an interpretation that does not simply say, this is a black story, but rather it's a story that has meaning for all of us, a story that helps us understand that it's okay to illuminate all the dark corners of the American experience, illuminate moments of evil as well as moments of great success. Ultimately, it seems to me that when I think about interpreting history generally, I'm always struck by something that I learned from Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Mobley. Before she died, she used to always say to me that there is nothing more powerful than a people, than a nation steeped in its history. And in some ways, she used to always say there's nothing more noble than honoring all of our ancestors by remembering. So in some ways, what I'm trying to do at the National Museum is honor all of our ancestors by remembering. Help the museum profession craft exhibitions that are meaningful, exhibitions that are important, but exhibitions that give our visitors a useful and a usable past. Give our visitors the tools to recognize that what the past does for us is really provide us with guidance in the world we live today. And I'll end with a quotation from James Baldwin, my favorite writer. Baldwin says it in many of his books, but he says it brilliantly when he says, we must remember that history is not about yesterday, but it's about today, because we carry history with us in everything we do. We are shaped by it, we are torn by it, we are touched by it. And in some ways, I keep thinking that what really is success to me is if I could do what someone who was quoted in the slave narrative said. There's a man named Mr. Cornelius. And in 1937, when he was interviewed by the WPA slave narratives, he was asked once again, does it matter that people remember? And he said, people will probably forget. But he said it in a really interesting way. He said, even though people will forget, they have to realize that slavery, that African American culture, is with us every day. It is in our courts. It is in our humor. It is in our politics. It is in our streets. It is in everything we do. And then he ended it brilliantly. He said, it is in everything we do, all the day, every day. I think we'll have a successful museum if we could help all Americans and all the international visitors who come to this museum realize that they are shaped in profound ways by African American culture all the day, every day. Now, I promised Manjula that I wouldn't go on forever, but I can. Well, what I'd like to do is sort of open it up to you for comments, discussion, questions, anything you'd like to talk about. And if anything I said made sense, great, and if I didn't, sorry.
You say that you're in a startup mode, and yet you've mentioned so many of the different, what other museums throughout the country are doing. What specifically has your museum done as far as collaborative efforts with those other museums?
We've done many things that really allow us to practice what we preach. On the one hand, we have been involved with the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is sort of one of the major bodies that help fund museums and libraries, and we've worked with them to craft a granting agency so that there's resources that we're able to give to African American museums or museums that care about interpreting African American culture. But we've also really begun to work collaboratively with many institutions on a variety of levels. For example, one of the things we're doing now is we've entered into a partnership with StoryCorps. You know what that is? StoryCorps is an entity that came out of sort of basically National Public Radio. It was a booth in New York where families would come together and tell their stories, and then they'd get a copy of it and they'd take it home. Well, what we've done is we've worked with StoryCorps now for this year to go around the country and collect 1,500 oral interviews of African Americans and others telling their stories. And we're doing that in partnership with other regional museums, so that we'll go into Memphis and we'll work with the Memphis Civil Rights Museum, or we'll go into Newark, New Jersey and work with the Newark Museum. So that part of what we're trying to do is recognize that when we come into a collaboration, we want people to see that our presence has made things better for them, made things easier for them. So we're doing things like that. We also are working on a series of exhibitions that are going to travel around the country. One of our first is called Let Your Motto Be Resistance, which looks at sort of African American portraiture through photography. That's going to open in New York in less than a month. And that's going to travel around the country and be at a variety of institutions, again, to demonstrate our presence helps with what you're doing. But also, part of what we've also done is really, through my staff, people like John Franklin who works for me, we've really said your job is to reach out, to work with them, work with a variety of institutions. So as part of what we're doing in terms of saving our treasures, we've worked with churches to begin to help churches preserve what is in their holdings and help make sure they've got disaster plans We were shaped by a fire that happened in Chicago almost a year ago that destroyed an old church. And so we do those kinds of things. So basically our goal is to recognize that collaboration is one of the factors that allows me to say yes to an initiative. While we'll do things that aren't always collaborative, that's the best way for me to say, you've got the resources you need.
Do you have like a shared database?
One of the things that will come out of this is partly through the oral histories, partly through the kind of Save Our Treasures. One of the things we have on our website, we're about to launch a brand new website in the next several months, and one of the things that's on that is the opportunity for people, for institutions, to list things they have. And that begins to let us create a database. Because it's not simply African Americans, it's history writ large. We really don't always know what's in other institutions. So that when you go to do an exhibition on something, you think, didn't I see that, or don't I know somebody? But we want to create an opportunity for people to actually say, okay, the Smithsonian may not have a World War I doughboy uniform worn by a black soldier, but we've got a list of where they are. So if you need them for study or for exhibition, we can help you find them. Yes.
I'm kind of intrigued about the collections aspect, and that you're starting to build the collections. And I'm wondering, in your position when you were Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs at American History, were you in the process of collecting there? And whereas American Indian Museum came in with a substantial collection, it's a very different experience for you.
Very much so. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting, one of the reasons why I actually came back and took this job is because so many different times in my career, there were things that I had to do that now I have to really try to master. So there was a time in my career where I helped to create a new museum and had to start from scratch. And I remember thinking, when I got through that, I'd never do that again. And so suddenly, here I am. And one of the challenges is thinking about how do you build the collection? Because if you look at any museum, any good museum curator will say to you, if a museum's been around more than 30 years, there's a whole lot of stuff we have that I wish we didn't have. There's a whole lot of stuff I wish we did have. So that part of what our challenge is not because there's a great need to open up and just say, give it to us, but to really think carefully about what it is that we need now. And so part of what we said is, for example, we know that there's a great need to collect images of the civil rights movement. Okay? It's in people's homes as well as the sort of ones you see in the newspaper. So we want to make sure that one of our major initiatives is collecting this material. So it means that we need to think about preserving photographs in a way that we didn't in American history.
That's kind of my curiosity, is what was happening at that time in American history.
Well, one of the things that
the opportunities that maybe were there or should have been there.
Well, one of the things that you all know about a museum is that museums are really driven by individual curators, individual interest. So that if you don't have people interested in certain areas in most museums, you're not going to collect that stuff. It may come over the transom, but on the whole, it's not a priority. So that we had a lot of people in American history who were people that I learned from to this day, who knew so much about so many different things. But they weren't all what, let's say, this museum is going to be focused on. So part of what we do is we learn from what happened, what American history is doing, how to collect effectively. We now think about how we also collect collaboratively. I know that's unheard of in many museums, but we're really thinking about, okay, how do you work with another institution and collect something? How do you share that? What are the legal implications of that? So all of that is part of what we're doing. And then I guess the other piece is to add to that is part of what we're doing is saying, okay, what are some of the things that you know you have to have? You may not know exactly how you're going to interpret it yet, but you know you're going to have. So you know that it would be great to have a slave cabin, right? It would be great to have a Pullman Porter Railroad car. So you can tell that story. It would be wonderful to have, a T-6, the trainer that the Tuskegee Airmen used when they were trained in Alabama in 42, 43, and 44. So what we're doing is looking already at what are the big things, because that'll also shape the building. It kind of would help to let your architect know, you better build a floor that can hold a Pullman Porter car rather than do that late. So we're trying to be a little on the top of things, but also to really then say, okay, what are stories things you're going to need? Well, costume, clothing that tells an array of stories, be it working class costumes of the elite. So we know we're going to need that. So we're looking at collecting those kinds of things. So in some ways, what we're doing is as I always tell the staff, we are building the ship at the same time we're taking the cruise. That means there's a lot of times you're bailing pretty fast, but it also means that you've really got an opportunity to really provide a core of things that are going to work effectively. Yes.
Yes, with this initiative, you're talking about collaboration with other museums. Is there going to be an actual call to the public?
Yes. There's going to be, what we're going to do is announce an initiative so that we're going to go into cities. There'll be a lot of publicity saying, come share your stuff when we come to pick a place, come to the New York Historical Society or come to the Schomburg Library in New York. Bring your materials. We'll look at that. We'll talk about it. We'll also do it on the website. Be able to sort of define what you have. The technology allows you to quickly upload images. In some ways, what the web will allow us to do, it'll allow us to look at things and to make some determinations in an easy way, rather than sort of saying, okay, I've got to go find who's got this, this uniform. They've given me a picture of it. It's maybe what we want. No, we can say no right away. We can try to avoid some of the sort of excess collecting that often happens. I think the other challenge of this is why it's so important for us to collect this way and kind of save our treasures is that part of what we want to do is everything we have to do has to be strategic. I've said to staff, everything's got to serve almost three masters. So if you create a national collecting initiative, one, it allows you to get things. It allows you to demonstrate that you're collaborating, which is important to us, but it also allows you, quite honestly, to be able to sort of show throughout to Congress, boy, I'm doing important stuff in Michigan, great stuff in Louisiana, think kindly of me because we're helping your constituents. So therefore, it really is not, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's basically saying to staff, the resources of a startup, be it financial, be it staff, mean that everything's got to give us at least one or two bounces for everything we try to do.
There's grassroots support and grassroots interest and people traveling to come to the museum if they haven't been donated.
Absolutely. Part of it is to recognize that you want to build a sense of ownership, a sense of national and, quite honestly, international ownership, because it is through that kind of ownership that helps you politically, because at some point we're going to do something that's going to anger somebody. Go to the bank on that. And so you're going to want to make sure that you've got people who say, I care about this institution. I care about the support of what it's trying to do. I think the other thing is they're trying to think about a 21st century museum, and that is a 21st century museum is a museum that's owned by people. And the challenge for the Smithsonian is that when I was at the Chicago Historical Society, there were a whole lot of people that loved that museum, that just said, this is mine. I've been going there since I was 3, and often everybody loves the Smithsonian, but not everybody owns the Smithsonian. So one of our challenges is to really be and to build on some of the great work that's being done in American history through the affiliates program to basically allow people outside of Washington to also say, I own this institution. So part of it is to think about, again, to think about what works in the 21st century and to think about what are the smart things we can do that'll serve us in good stead. Because the other challenge of this is we're also trying to think about what happens to this museum 30 years from now. You know, I was at American History after it had been open for 30 years, and suddenly there were all these questions about how do you affect change? What should the collections be now? Stories that were done in 1964, they're not the same stories you want to tell today. So part of what we're doing, too, is thinking about how through the web, through the collecting we do, through the way we craft exhibitions, that we create maybe a more flexible might not be the right word, a more nimble institution. So even though I hope I'm not here 30 years from now, I want to make sure that 30 years from now, whoever is sitting in this chair doesn't say, I wish those folks had thought about X, Y, or Z. They'll probably say that about a couple things. We'd like to at least craft an institution that's more nimble for the next 2-3 generations of leaders. Yes.
You've talked several times about the African American history and culture being quintessential American history and culture. In that context, what do you see as the relationship between African American National Museum of African American History and Culture and across, no, you won't be across the hall, but down the road, the American History Museum? And do you ever foresee a time when that kind of split, sometimes seen schizophrenically as two different, if it's the same story, do you foresee a time when all of this will be so intrinsically intertwined that there would be no need for a separate vision of an African American history?
I would suggest, I'd take your question and frame it in a little different way. I would, first of all, as somebody that spent most of my career at American History, it's probably the place second to this new museum that I care most about. So therefore, I know that it will be the place we will do a lot of collaboration. But rather than see it as one day we'll all become one, I would argue the way to think about this is much like you think about really good Civil War sites. If you go to a Civil War battlefield, be it Gettysburg or Antietam, what happens is that each of those battlefields tell you the story of the Civil War, but they tell it to you in a different way, in a different lens. And I would argue that I would encourage the Museum of American History, the Museum of American Art, Natural History, to talk to us, but to continue to do stories about race and African American culture. Because what we want is to provide the public with a variety of ways into this story. So for me, I don't see it as competing. I don't see it as one day we'll change America, but rather we will change America. But there'll always be an opportunity to see a story a little differently. And that's what this will do. And in some ways, as educators, you know, one of the most important things you can do is reinforce, reinforce, reinforce. And this will be a way for us to do that.
And just to follow up on that, and it's kind of a repetition, but you've said that it's kind of the experience is a quintessential American experience, yes?
Yes.
So how are you going to get everyone in the door, to kind of look at it in that way? Certainly, initially, there'll be a tremendous amount of interest. We're all excited about it. But really, there's, as you mentioned in a lot of what you write, there's not that kind of recognition in the country that it is our story. So,
it's a good question. The quick answer would be what I used to say in graduate school. I don't have the answer now, but give me 5 minutes and I'll figure it out. But
it's an ongoing discussion.
But I think that's really the key. Is first of all is to recognize that's a goal, so that therefore everything you do, you begin to frame exhibitions. For example, what you almost do is much like a political campaign. You say to yourself, what are the stories we tell that appeal to X? What are the stories that appeal to Y? What are the stories that appeal to Z? What are the stories that appeal to all? So we begin to think about that. I think part of what will be key to our success is, quite honestly, to be a very good museum. I think that if you're a very good museum, if you take technology, there's a wonderful museum in Brazil called the Museum of Portuguese Language that really takes technology and really something simple like language and unpacks it for the public. Helps you see how that language is this great lens, understand who you are as Brazilians. Well, in some ways, we want to make sure that we do things like that are different, that are innovative, that cross many boundaries. We also want to take things that we know people engage on. People engage on African American music. You want to be careful, you don't want to be stereotypical, but you want to be able to do what Bernice Johnson Reagan, who worked with me at the Smithsonian for many years, always taught me, that you take it as a two-sided coin. One side is tap your toe to the music, and the other side is to help the public understand what rhythm and blues tells us about American life in the 1950s. So we want to take some of those things that have broad appeal and make sure they're there. But the one thing I've been struck by my years at the Smithsonian is, first of all, at the Smithsonian you get, what's the word I want? People will take a chance to see things, to explore things that they wouldn't do in their own hometown because they feel they're here and watch, they need to do that. So part of what you want to do is do a good job, is get them engaged on this so they say, oh, I want to know that story. Because I'll be honest, when the Holocaust Museum first opened, not a lot of people said, that's really what I want to go see. It really was the sense of, this is pretty good. Even though it's a horrible story, I need to see it. So in some ways, not that I'm trying to create a horrible story, but that what we want to do is recognize that people are going to get excited about it. You do word of mouth. You also think strategically. You think about how do you market it. And I mean, I have been, and I'm an optimistic guy anyway, so I know that. But you know, when I was in Iowa 2 weeks ago, because there was snow, and I remember that. And what hit me was I'm talking in Iowa, and I was talking to this wonderful farmer, guy, never left Iowa in his life, and his notion was, that's a story I want to know. And so for me, there are a lot of people who you might not think would be engaged with this. I think the other thing to keep in mind for me is that the kids that are age of my daughters, 21 and 18, these are kids that in some ways have been raised and shaped by African American culture in many ways. These are kids that have real interest in that, trying to understand that. So I think that in some ways we have an opportunity to really do something that not many museums get. We get to approach this from different points of view. We get to hit sort of our generation, but there's an opportunity to really engage a younger generation because they ask different questions. They see things in a different way. And so I think that that's part of the reason how I expect to make this a universal story. I want to be honest. I want you to always be able to go through this and see and understand African American culture. But I think if we do it right, you'll see and understand yourself as well.
I think it's very exciting because my kids are your kids' ages, and they really are genuinely concerned and curious about this story. They don't understand, maybe you get this as well, what happened, and would really and truly like to explore it.
Exactly.
And they have had so much exposure at this point to African American culture predominantly through music.
Right.
So it's very
film and other
film, and it's very exciting that I think it's one of the few museums that has an opportunity to really bring young people in.
I really believe that.
In all our museums, but
I really believe it. One of the things that Chicago taught me at the Chicago Historical Society, now you've got to imagine, this is the Chicago Historical Society. On first blush, this was not a place that 15-year-old kids said, boy, I can't wait to be there. And so what we did was I crafted a project called Teen Chicago, where I had my dear friend Studs Terkel teach teenagers how to do oral history. And then I taught them how to read photographs, how to do historical research. And I said, you got to give me a 2-year commitment. First year, you're going to go around the city and you're going to interview people of all ages and ask them what it was like to be a teenager for them in Chicago. And so they collected all this amazing new data. Then I said, year 2, you're going to craft a major exhibition on history of being a teenager in Chicago from the 1890s to today. And when I first brought it up, the kids said to me, and these were a great diverse group of kids, and the kids said to me, let me be honest, we want to tell an exhibition on us, but we don't really care about anybody else. And I said, well, I'll tell you what you do. Let's do some of the interviews first. And it really came home one day when I had these 2 young women. They were interviewing a woman who was in her probably 80s, and she had been a tennis star in the 30s. And she told this story of being in high school and coming home from practice, and her father had obviously come home from work early and was waiting for her. Apparently, one of the neighbors had called the father's place of employment to say, your daughter's walking around the neighborhood half naked in these short shorts playing tennis. And so when one of the little girls looked at me and said, do you mean to tell me parents were stupid even then? And that was an eye-opening moment. They said, I get it. And they realized that what history told them is that the story of somebody in 1930 was a similar story of identity, of finding your own autonomy, and they found real resonance with that. And so I think if we can think creatively about how we engage a variety of audiences and give people meaningful ways to see the connections, because it doesn't just happen. You know, my kids are the kids of historians. My mother is, my mother, God forgive me, my wife is a museum educator. I'm dead. And so, oh, that was scary. But, oh, it's going to be a long night. But what really hit me was that once my youngest daughter asked me this very same question, she said, it's Black History Month, you're giving all these talks. All of my friends are different and diverse. We all know different things. Isn't this story you're trying to tell as outmoded as the white and colored signs that were once there? Well, obviously she got a weekend of lectures. But it made me really think about how do you help kids understand why this is important. And ultimately, it is important to them because even though they may grapple with it differently, it's still an issue. And so what we want to do is help them understand why it's still an issue and how there are ways to get beyond it. So I think for me, part of what's exciting about this is, you know, if I was building the National Museum of anything, this would be the greatest thing going. But then you add this on, which is both more difficult, which has politics that are really, I didn't talk about all those issues. There are many segments of various communities that say the museum should be this. Some say it should be a Black Holocaust museum. Others say it should be a story of slavery. Others say it should be a story of music. I mean, so there's all the kind of politics of that. But I think that for me, what is so exciting is this really is the hardest thing we will do, and that's what the Smithsonian should be doing. The Smithsonian ought to be doing the most difficult work in America. It ought not to be doing work that is easy, because you've got such gifted people, such gifted resources, such a wonderful audience. This is the place that ought to say, our job is really to make America better. And that's what we're going to aspire to do. We may not get there all the way, but I swear we're going to get close.
It seems like it's going to be so hard, because one of the things that we talk about within our group is what is the voice, or whose voice is coming through in the exhibits. And you know, with that, you're talking about engaging the young people, having them also be appreciative of what has happened in the past, and you know, who owns the history. How are you going to tackle all of these? You know, whose voice is it? Is you know, the voice of a group of people who say, this is what's supposed to be in the museums because we think it's important? Are you going to be engaging others? How is this going to work?
One of the things that I believe very strongly in is that the best museums are museums that are run by attention. Attention between an audience-driven way of interpreting and a scholarly way. Okay? By that I mean, I do not believe that it is the autocratic voice of the museum that simply says this is how you will tell. But I do believe, however, that it is scholarship that has to be the umbrella under which we do everything. So therefore, there will be those issues that we'll explore. And there will be things that the public may not want to explore, but we will. So I'm not one of these people that believe that it's simply like I was selling a widget. Find the best way to get everybody to get excited about your widget. But rather, the challenge for me is to find that real tension. And I think that it means that there are going to be times where we're going to really work hard to try to create multiple points of view so that people can begin to explore not so much that there are three different public interpretations, but that rather that there are, one, ways that we empower you to interpret, and that two, that there are many different ways to look at a subject. I think that's really important. I would suggest to you, now this is my own hobby horse, but I would suggest to you that what the best history museum should do, more than anything else, is help people feel comfortable with ambiguity. We too often give simple answers to complex questions. And we say it's because of the medium or because of the lack of artifacts, and I think that's a cop-out. I would argue that we can't always do that, but that if people could come away realizing there are real shades of gray, that there are unanswered questions, that there are questions that were answered one way in 1930, and we've got to find a new way in 2003. I mean, I think that's one of the things I want. So on the one hand, my wife says I'm full of contradictions, but that's true. But on the one hand, it is this notion of saying scholarship really is the umbrella. So I want to make sure that people see the great thinking of John O. Franklin and a variety of scholars. But I also want to realize that it's not enough just to do that. We've got to find that way that the public says, I get it, I get the ownership. And I guess where I learned that was in a strange place, was in Japan. When I ran this project for the Smithsonian in the, I guess that would be the early to mid-90s, we were going to do a major exhibition on America, do it in Japan. When suddenly we realized after going to Japan, you can't just do it the way we want. That's not going to work for a Japanese audience. It's not enough to put a massive exhibition that you think is spectacular, but nobody gets it. And so my time in Japan taught me to find that tension between what you as a scholar feel is crucially important and how to convey it in a way that audiences get to own it. And that means a lot of audience survey, a lot of audience testing, but it also means being true to the scholarship that is really undergirding everything you do. And I think we will experiment. One of the joys of, not many, but one of the joys of not having a building for a few more years is it allows me to test things on the web. So as part of our new web presence, I'm going to test exhibit ideas. I'm going to test interpretive postures. I'm going to test a lot of things so that when I put it up in the building, it's still going to upset some people. But on the whole, we'll have vetted a lot of this. And we'll also allow us to do something that we can't do. When I would do surveys, 5 years ago, we'd survey 5,000 people and think we've done a lot. Well, on the web, there's a lot of people I can survey, a lot more data I can gather. So we really look at the web presence as first a way to say, okay, we're here. Here's great stuff we're doing. But secondly, it's, okay, here's how you help us test and fine-tune what we want to be when we grow up. Yes?
To build on that, and something you said earlier about cultural borrowing, could you explain what you meant by that? Is that associated with this idea of testing other perspectives?
That's part of cultural borrowing, yes. But it's also, what I mean is that, how do I put, I grew up in a little town that was predominantly Italian, okay? So I grew up speaking Sicilian, okay? And there was a lot that I learned from my Nabletan, Sicilian neighbors, and a lot they learned from us. I rarely see that in any kind of exhibition that talks about how people struggled against each other, but also where they learned, where they borrowed. So there's that, as well as then looking at what can we borrow from a variety of scholarly avenues and genres. My belief is, as a good historian, as a good museum person, I'll steal from anybody. So I want to know what is being done brilliantly in Brazil. I want to know what's happening at the Apartheid Museum in South Africa. I want to know what this tiny little historical house in upstate New York is doing that'll give me an idea that I can steal. I want to know what the best students at the Cooperstown graduate program are saying about what's the best way to communicate with young Americans. So my goal is to recognize something that I was taught as a child. As smart as you are, you don't have a monopoly on wisdom. And so my goal is to create an institution that recognizes we're pretty smart. We don't have a monopoly on wisdom. and we're going to learn from every corner because the story we tell is so important, so necessary, that we've got to try to get it right. And the only way to get it right is to be willing to listen from all places. Yes.
People come to the museum sometimes to get the story, and they look at it as if it's true. This is the truth. And I think it's really good that you're going to try to give different perspectives, because people have been so spoon-fed all through school, they're told facts, and it's like this and it's like that, and they don't realize that you have to think your way through everything in life. There really are very few facts. And so I think it's a good idea that you're going to aim at trying to get people to see variations and shades of gray, because too many people just want to be shown the answer.
And that's, and in all honesty, that's also a challenge, because if people want that and suddenly you don't give people that, you run the risk of people say, wait a minute, they didn't give me, they made me work too hard. So I think it is, as I used to tell people when we used to get criticized at various stages for exhibitions we did during my career, my notion was, don't attack me for one exhibition. Look at the totality of what's on the floor. So I think that as we build a museum, we will look at what's on the totality of the floor. That there will be moments where we're going to make you work. Moments where we're going to really say, ooh, this ambiguity is hitting you right in the face. There are going to be other moments where we might do less of that. Where we might say, here is a more manageable story that allows you to celebrate the American experience. So we're going to prod, we're going to criticize, we're going to celebrate. We're going to make you cry, we're going to make you sing. And I think that in some ways, I would argue that I became a better curator when I became a filmmaker, because it made me think visually, it made me think about audiences in different ways. And what I used to do, and as soon as we get a larger staff, I'm going to do it here, curators that work for me in Chicago and other places, I encourage them to take film writing courses, because I thought that was one of the best ways to think about writing exhibitions. That we think that exhibitions is a written media, but it's a visual medium. And so for me, I say that to say that what I want to do is find a variety of ways to tell this story. And I just think that the totality of what we do will not be a hodgepodge, but rather there'll be opportunities like a political campaign or a good film. There are times that the tension is real clear. There are times I'm going to have to ask you to think hard to figure out where we're going. And there are times where you're going to say, I get it. There's a happy ending. And there are times going to say, I wish there were a happy ending. So I think that's the way we're trying to frame this institution. Yes.
In looking at the story from different perspectives, you mentioned earlier that it would also be a place of reconciliation. I'd like you to elaborate on that, please.
Let me do it with an example. At the Chicago Historical Society, when we did the show on lynching, one of the things I did was I created a monument within the exhibition. I realized that all of us have seen these images of people in these horrible lynching images, but none of us knew their names. So I created a monument of names. And I had a variety of religious communities come in and read the names, call the names. And what it did was it really brought different communities together over a subject that was seen initially as an African-American story. When suddenly colleagues would say, calling of a name is of my community as well. And that by doing that, I'm now beginning to embrace this broader story. I think that part of what we want to do is, first of all, recognize that reconciliation and healing, one of the first steps is clarity and communication. So part of it is the stories we want to tell and the opportunity to engage dialogue. I think that if we can work collaboratively with institutions, we can then do this kind of dialogue in Chicago. We can do something in New York. We can do something in South Africa. I think what we also want to do is that we want to recognize that as much as we tell stories about the past, we want to create programs that are about today. So we want to create, we might create a leadership program that talks about what are the challenges for leaders in the 21st century when it comes to battling discrimination. So we really want to look at not just being, I want to take care of our core first. I want to make sure we're a good museum. But as I think about what a good museum in the 21st century is, there's all these sort of 20th century or 21st century programmatic opportunities that will allow us to be a different kind of institution. Ultimately, I think that sometimes reconciliation and healing is real simple in terms of what it takes to begin the dialogue. I spent a lot of time in South Africa, and my first trip to Robben Island to sit and listen to a prisoner talk to a guard while I'm in this prison that they held Nelson Mandela, it was one of the most powerful moments of my life. And people came away for days talking about that. When you go, I mean, I was in there's a place called the Docklands in London, which is where the Museum of the City of London, and that's where many of the slave ships in London came in. And they're now just simply doing some living history programs about what happened on those docklands has led to a lot of interesting discussion in the UK around the abolition of slavery, abolition of the slave trade. So my goal is to really look and see who does what best and recognize that what a museum does is a museum creates sacred space if it does it right. And what I want to do is create sacred space that allows people then to go from that space for real communication, for real reconciliation, for real healing. That's the goal. Do I know how to do it all? I do not. But when the door opens, I'll know. And I think that's one of the gifts of working at the Smithsonian, is that you've got amazingly gifted people throughout this institution who can help you. But also, I can call anybody in the world and they'll help because it's the Smithsonian. And so all you have to do is be comfortable enough to say, I need help. And I'm real comfortable saying, help me. But I think that it really is our challenge to do this, is to really, as we get into the details of doing the work, of building the building, of raising the funds, not to let anybody, myself included, lose that vision, because that's what's going to make it special. But that's going to be a challenge as you begin to sort of do your day-to-day work and you struggle with the things you need to do and how to respond to this congressman or write this budget request. So part of my challenge and my job is to, I have a consultant that's brilliant, and she always says to me, remember, your job simply is to always go high. And so my job is to help remember the staff that no matter what we're doing, go high. We're trying to get people to the promised land.
Any more questions?
Are we out of time? Yeah. Okay. One of the questions that I had was, you talked earlier about how museums are centered around one curatorial vision. This is one of my hobby horses. So, as an educator, I stress with my students the importance of authorship, that you're always, that it is one person's point of view or priority or bias that comes out in anything that they read, anything that they see. And most museums have this very large institutional voice. They do not have specific authorship to specific exhibits, even though we know that this was created in a specific time by a specific group of people, and therefore its relevance is in that context. How do you see your museum dealing with that issue? I know there are some museums, Smithsonian museums, that do list curators, and others, most that do not.
Boy, that is one of the more difficult questions I will ever ask, because I have answered it different ways, different points of my career. I was one of the people at American History who demanded that we sign exhibitions, that we allow curators to sign it, and then the reaction was, but it's not just a curatorial vision, so if other people play. I mean, one of the challenges is we still, as a profession, museums, we still haven't figured out how do you really share authority and define who gets to say what, who gets to control this. I've curated a lot of exhibitions in my time, and I would say that 70% of what has got on the floor was definitely the interpretation I wanted, but there's a 30% that, the rough edges were made smooth by design or by artifacts or by whatever. I really think that it's important. Let me back up. There were times in my career when I swore the most important thing we could do was to make sure people saw it was an individual effort, not an institutional effort. I thought that would help with criticism from Congress and other folks as well. But then I realized that it's so hard to really say, this is the story you want. When I write a book, it is my interpretation. I can stand behind 98% of the words, and the 2% that the editor fixed are better than words I would have come up with anyway. But when it comes to an exhibition, I'm just not sure. And so I'm waffling because I don't know. But I think that what I will probably do is I like the notion of signed exhibitions because I like the notion of people taking responsibility for their points of view. So my gut feeling tells me that we will sign our exhibitions as we go through this process. But I have to be honest. You always speak through who you are. I'm a historian, I'm a curator, so I will listen to other colleagues make their argument as well. But I personally like that. I've always liked signing any exhibition I did, even when people picketed me. I still like signing because I think it's part of the challenge. Part of the challenge of signing, quite honestly, is how does a curator receive the attention and most importantly, the acclaim they need to? If you're saying you want to be perceived by your colleagues in the academy as a good historian, well, then you got to sign the exhibitions. But then if you sign the exhibitions and 30% are outside of your control, is it still yours? So there are all these issues. One of the reasons I pushed signing was that I really felt it was important for curators and historians in museums to be viewed as equal to historians outside of museums. So, and I think that still probably is the major reason why I believe that.
And I guess I look at it from not the perspective of the person who's putting it together, but from someone who's looking at it. And I feel it's important as a viewer, as the audience, to know that this comes from a source, some source, whatever, and a group of people perhaps, but that it is not an institutional truth.
But here's where it gets difficult. Let's take, for example, a show that I'm very proud of was The American Presidency. Okay? Now, that show, Harry Rubenstein and I worked on it, Spencer Crew, and so therefore I would argue that the interpretation that was there was ours. But the idea for the show wasn't ours. It was Secretary Small's. And so some of the things that we ultimately did may have been shaped by his initial vision. So how do you balance all that out? So while in fact, before they took the show down, it was signed by us and it was real clear who did what. But I think that is a little interesting issue. I will, in this new museum, there might be 5 of the exhibitions that are the permanent exhibitions that I say we're doing.
But can't the concept be still attributed to Smalls? Original concept, Smalls, and actual execution of some of these things, curators, these people, scholars, whatever. That's what I mean by a team.
Yeah, I guess here's where the film analogy breaks down. If you're a producer of the film, you do shape a lot of what goes on as well as the director. But if you're a director of the museum and you say, and I say to John Franklin, John, do an exhibition on slavery in Washington, D.C. Now, that may not be what he wanted to do, but I'll say that's what we have to do. And then he will bring brilliance to it and execute it in a wonderful way. So what role do I have in that? What role should it be? I'm not shaping his interpretation. So while I'm splitting hairs, I think the challenge is working in a museum is different than working in the academy. And it is ultimately, even if we sign it, what I discovered is, even when I signed it, most of the people still thought it was the Smithsonian or the Museum of American History. So in some ways, the institutional weight outweighs the individual curatorial vision. Even if that's not the case in the exhibition, it's the case in the way I think it's interpreted by the outside. So I don't know. I mean, I would like to, what we'll probably do is try it different ways. But part of what I also like is people signing, because I want people to take responsibility for what they say. If you make an interpretation that's pretty outrageous, but we like it, I still want people to know that that's your interpretation, so you can't always hide behind the institution.
I think that's an important point, because conversely, I think the public needs to take responsibility for what they think when they go through.
That's true.
And, you know, how do you kind of remind all of us that we have a responsibility to react, to think, to analyze as we go through, that it's not what you're saying, that it's not Lonnie Bunch says X, Y, Z, and therefore that's what we're going to think, or, you know, because we have a tendency to do that, particularly in museums for some reason.
Right. I think that's right. And I think that it's an interesting question of, we always talk about in museums sharing authority. At a certain point, there's something good about sharing authority. At a certain point, there's something bad about it. And trying to find that right, that right moment of share. I mean, we were just talking about an example today. There are several museums in the South that specialize in the kind of story of the Confederacy. And that is an important story. It's an important part of our history. But often those museums don't start where I would start, which is they lost the Civil War, which means you shape it in a different way. So it's really interesting to me to think about, how do you sort of help the public see that, boy, this is not as simple as you think. And how do you help the public? I mean, I want the public also to challenge museums more. I mean, I really like that notion of the public saying, you know what, I didn't buy this, and here's why. And that's hard because still, especially of a certain generation, it is still, museums are the place, the research tells us, it's the place that the public trusts maybe more than just about anything else. And part of that trust comes from, I would argue, the intimidation of you're walking into a museum. Absolutely.
It's like a church. You don't go into the cathedral and challenge.
That's right. You go to the cathedral and you lower your voice and you say, the relic. And I think that's the challenge.
Just taking on from there, certain exhibitions do ask for public feedback, but that also gets selected, what's put out. Certain very cutting-edge exhibitions, there was a board with viewers, public comments. Not every comment was put on. Right. So how open and how does the average visitor feel comfortable in reacting, in sharing? Is there a mechanism? Is there a way? How would you do that?
Well, I think that there are a couple things. I think that putting up opportunities for the visitor to engage, to leave their points of view, that's nice, but I argue that only works if you've, in the front end, helped visitors feel comfortable that they can have a sense of ownership. Because I would argue that half of what you get is good, and half of what you get is just nothing. And maybe half's good enough. But I was always struck by museums that said, how do we, almost like the Holocaust, how do we humanize this so that you feel that your story has some way to influence, is worthy and equal? I don't know how many times I've been in people's homes, either collecting things or talking to people, and they said, my story isn't important. And then you tell them it is, and then they feel the right to begin to say, well, what about this or that? And I'm not convinced that we at museums help the public when they first walk in say, this is your story too. Your story is an equal part of this. And if you do that, it becomes easier, I think, at the rear end for the public to sort of make their changes and make their connections. I mean, I do think one of the changes that we haven't wrestled with effectively yet is technology. being able to extend the visit through the web, being able to extend the way the public sort of gets to share their points of view through the web and other things. We haven't figured that out yet. You know, we're now wrestling with all the handheld devices. Well, it'd be nice if in some of the handheld devices there's a real way to get public interaction. How does this, what do people think about this as you're now going through it, so that you can see what people think about the interpretation of X or Y. So I do not pretend, I'm a 19th century historian, okay, so I do not pretend to have mastered technology. However, I do think that is something that's going to help us do this more effectively.
One of the things, well, last one. One of the things that you mentioned, and you had the 4 issues, and you basically were saying that you felt that the African American culture in other museums was like, oh yeah, and there's the African American view over there in the corner as an aside. Let's do a converse of that. How are you anticipating incorporating, let's say, non-African American races in the museum? You know, white people of other
That's
colors.
my favorite question.
Okay, I'm glad I said it.
In some ways, what I find interesting is I was doing a series of oral histories once in Memphis, Tennessee, and I was interested in the history of this particular section of town. And they sent me to go see this minister. It was a white minister. And I remember thinking, oh, what is this about? And this guy had wonderful stories, but more importantly is he introduced me to a whole other source of information, of people who saw that town in an interesting way, sometimes comparable, sometimes very different. I think that part of our challenge is to make sure that there are many voices. For example, you tell the story of the Civil Rights Movement. In many museums, you forget that it's a multiracial story. So you make sure that happens. You don't overstate the case, but you make sure that people see, you know, this world. I'm very interested in this notion of the world we made together. Where did we make a world together? And where did that work? Where did it not work? But I think that that notion of letting people see that there's a, I don't want to steal Jesse Jackson's line, but there's a rainbow that has shaped the African American experience, just as the African American experience has shaped the rainbow. And so I want to figure out how we do that. I also think that I'm very interested in returning to regionalism. I'm very interested in how when I was a kid and we'd go visit my relatives in the South, it was really different. Not just on a lot of levels, but I mean language and food. There wasn't a McDonald's everywhere. And so I'm interested in looking at regional variations, which also allows me to look at how different groups played this out. For example, if I said to you today, what's Southern versus what's white Southern versus what's black Southern? It's kind of hard sometimes to separate that out. Some you can. So it almost means that if we tell some of those stories, you've got to cross many lines. So I think that those are some of the ways we want to try to get this. I really think that, and maybe it's my naivete, but I really do believe that we as Americans have fought and loved, bumped and learned, borrowed and stolen, hated and talked to each other. And I think that part of what we want to do is show that messy process, to let people see that we've crossed many lines as we do this, as well as to see, truthfully, that there were separate worlds. We still laugh about we still talk about, one of the most segregated places in the world today is church on Sunday. So there are things we can explore that help people cross some of those lines.
Thank you. We have some guests here today, and would you have any comments or from our staff, or John Franklin? Do you want to introduce John Franklin?
John Franklin is one of the senior people on my staff. He's been at the Smithsonian as long as I have, and is a gifted historian and is somebody who really has helped me think about how we collaborate effectively. And many of the answers that I gave you about collaboration, I stole from him.
And John has some guests, so we would love to hear from you.
Well, yes, I'd first like to introduce our guests. Jarvis Mantovani from Sao Paulo, from the Robert Marinho Foundation, which developed the Museum of the Portuguese Language, and Curtis Carter from Marquette University, who has a program of interns that come from the university that look at arts and public policy here in Washington. They happen to be my guests today. My question to you, Lonnie, is, in a nation with many forms of prejudice and discrimination, how do we situate prejudice and discrimination against African Americans in a larger context of discrimination, and present that particularly to young people who feel we are beyond prejudice and discrimination in the present society?
I think one of the challenges for us is when we talk about, you can only tell 10 stories in a museum. Some might be very traditional, might be the history of the civil rights movement. Others might be very different, like you might do one on innovation and look at innovation from science, from music, from whatever. You might do one on kind of the notions of freedom or equality and allow it to play out across the board. So it's not just equality through the lens of the black experience, but it's the search for equality in America, and to see where there's been crossover, where there's been and where there's been real attempts not to have that happen. So I think that, John, the notion I would argue that we have to do is we have to think about whether it is exhibitions in the totality or parts of exhibitions that allow us to both go deep into the subject and then that pull back out, that let us look more globally at some of the broader questions that have shaped us and shaped us as all Americans. So I'd like to see us wrestle with questions like discrimination, or I'd frame it discrimination and equality, things like that, because I think that would be an interesting way to look at how we built this world together and where we didn't build it together.
One of the questions comes up in our policy groups with the congressional interns is, well, in differentiating how we present culture, we can use race versus other ethnic differences a valid criteria for sorting out cultural institutions. I'm not saying my view, but that question comes up, and I'd be interested to know how you respond.
I think that this museum is, with all of our interest in global issues, it's an African American or it's an American institution. So part of what we want to do is help people understand the country they're in. And part of that is the sort of dominance of race as a factor of definition, as a factor of opportunity, as a factor of privilege. It doesn't mean that we don't want to wrestle with questions of class or ethnicity, but I think that we want to make sure that, at the very least, the public that goes to our institution understands what the lens is that we're looking through. But I think what you also raise is really the interesting question about contemporary history, contemporary stories. It raises the question of, what does African American mean today? It's like somebody asked me, what does the museum look like? If this was 1900, I could almost argue most blacks lived in the South. Well, maybe the museum would have some kind of Southern feel to it or Southern motif. Well, those days are gone. So what's the motif there? I don't know. It's the same thing with 50 years ago, you wouldn't define African Americans as new Ethiopian immigrants who've come in. I mean, there's a whole change in dynamics. There's also a change in the dynamics of what race means. 50 years ago, race was African American in most cases, not in all cases. But now it is a much broader conversation. And the challenge for us is to think about both what are the strengths and what are the limits of multiculturalism. I mean, one of the challenges of multiculturalism is it posits a notion that I love, which is that all cultures are equally valid. But the other side of that is not all cultures are equal at various historical moments. And that's the other side of it. So you have to be able to make an argument that maybe African American culture becomes a dominant culture for a period because that's how we dealt with issues of citizenship or equality. But I think the real question that John is very good at sort of raising to us is how current is this museum? And how do we reach out to new communities? What is it? Many of us have, our families are multiracial. What does that mean? How does that play out? So there's a whole array of things that my argument is, at the very least, if we provide the strong foundation, help people understand how we got to where we are, and then programmatically and many other things, periodically wrestle with these questions or link with organizations that are doing that. That's how I think we'll get at some of that. But it really is a fascinating question to say, in some ways, America of 2007 has some of the same baggage, same issues, same debates, same divisions. In other ways, it has some things that even those of us that are relatively older than that wouldn't have thought about in our own youth. So that's the interesting challenge.
I don't know if this is, following up or if it's the same thing, but you have said that one of the challenges before us, whether we write, preserve, exhibit history, or consume culture, is to do a better job of centralizing race. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on that.
It's awful when people read your writing. It used to be you'd write, nobody read it, maybe my mother, and now people reading like, well, let me quote you, like, did I write, somebody sent something the other day and they quoted an article I wrote in 92. I was like, 92? Man, I didn't even remember I wrote that article. But I think what I would love to see happen is, by centralizing, what I really meant was that people see this is all of our story. This is the story that shaped us all. And that rather than simply say it is an ancillary story, which is what happens in a lot of places, I would argue that it becomes the story to help us all understand this. At the very least, what I'd love to see is the realization that we all have race, so that race isn't simply a black story, which means that we all help to create what that means. So therefore, understanding what role we played, understanding, it's fascinating understanding how African American culture shaped the immigrant experience. How many immigrants in the 19th century were able to improve their lot in life by becoming as American as they can, which meant separating themselves from an African American experience. You became American because you were different. You were better than them. You were different than them. And how the bulk of immigrants that come to this country since 1964 is in part because the immigration laws changed as a result of Civil Rights Act of '64. So there are simple ways to help people say, boy, even if I'm from a place where I've had no contact at all, that story has still made it possible for me to migrate from Southeastern Europe or Asia. So, trying to find that way to sort of move it to the center of what we do. I'm just simply arguing that as Americans, we often look at ourselves through interesting lenses. We look at ourselves through the lens of equality. We look at ourselves through the lens of upward mobility. And what I'm suggesting is one of the important lenses that we all could look through is this lens of African American culture, this lens of race that is as illuminating as some of the other ways we look at ourselves. And that's all. Not saying it's the only way or the best way, but that it's an important way to sort of basically, my wife's an artist. I can't draw worth a lick, right? So for me, I think it's really amazing that you can actually draw within the lines and fill in the whole box. So what I'm simply trying to do is help Americans fill in the box. Instead of having big parts that aren't colored in, I'm trying to just fill in the box. That tells you how creative I am, fill in the box. Yes?
Lonnie, you said the museum should make the visitor think, make us cry. I think we can do that. Enjoy. The public programs, with music would be, I think, an easier aspect to deal with, and we look forward to a lot of that. I'm sure you're already planning. Using a lens from an outsider, coming into what's the American culture, I have a very hard to understand. For me, it's very hard, and they're very complex. If you look at the sports, sportsmen. At times, I see it as discrimination, and at times I see it as celebration, or what heroes, and I just go through mixed feelings, reactions, and I wondered if you had to do an exhibition on the great sports heroes, how would that be told?
Again, I'm one of these people that have had chances to screw up other things in my career, so hopefully I'll get it right this time. But, I curated a major exhibition on the history of blacks in the Olympics, and it was in time for the 1984 Games in Los Angeles. And what I learned was that if you frame this as a simple story of athletic achievement, you've missed a big part of what the story is. For me, sports, and again, I may be a one-trick pony, so forgive me, but what I'm really looking at is how do I use sport, how do I use music, how do I use dance to help us understand America? And so when I look at the role of sport, I might look at the early story of blacks in the Olympics. The early black Olympians were all from either Big Ten schools or Ivy League schools. So that meant they had to be the best of the best already. And that they felt that part of what they were doing was obviously running for America, but they were running to prove their worth to the broader society. So it's those kind of things that I would look through as I look at things like sport. I think that sport also gives us an opportunity to look at stereotypes, to go from a period when people believed that the African American was so inferior that they couldn't be equal on sports, to people taking to the other extreme, that somehow African American bodies are so superior that non-African Americans aren't going to be able to compete. So I think there's some really interesting ways to look at sport. But the other side I also do want to look to is just how wondrous the achievement is. When I was doing the Olympian show, I love how things happen for you. I was trying to focus on various parts of the history of blacks in the Olympics, and one of the things I wanted to look at was the 1968 Black Power Olympics. You all remember the fist, and for those of us of a certain age, it was a really telling moment. So I met several Olympians, and I was talking to them about I wanted to collect this material and tell this story. And they said to me, look, we've been ripped off. Now, this is 1984, so, it's almost 20 years later. We've been ripped off, and we don't trust anybody. And there was a woman named Barbara Farrow who won an Olympic medal in 1968. She said to me, I'll tell you what I'll do, Lonnie. I will call together all the black Olympians in Southern California to my house, and you can come make your argument. So I am told to come to his house at 7:30. Luckily, everybody's there at 7 o'clock. So I walk in, there's one chair here and like 50 chairs there. So I sit down and I start making my, this is going to be an important show. I need your help. Nothing. It's just not working. And for an hour and a half, I am trying every trick in the book. And I am now exhausted. I'm just, forget it. When I get exhausted, my New Jersey accent comes out. Okay? So suddenly, John Carlos, who was one of the people that did the Black Power Fist, he said to me, you sound like you're from New Jersey. And I said, yeah. And he said, New Jersey, I can trust New Jersey people. And he actually stood up and said, we can trust this guy because he's from New Jersey. And they all began to work with me. So I was like, who knows? So, sometimes it's about scholarship, sometimes it's about creativity, sometimes it's about having a New Jersey accent that you don't lose. So in a way, for me, the story is that I'm always struck that there are so many different things I learn by looking at sport in different ways. And so I think it is something that you don't want to oversell, you don't want to play into stereotypes, but I think it is both a way to engage some audiences who may not come in, but would get excited about being able to see, somebody hit, run, throw. But I think the other side of it is if you then get them in and you tell the richness of the story. You tell the story of, in 1948, when the American Olympic team went to London, on the boat, there were black athletes and white athletes, and they talked to me about the segregation on this little boat, and how it hurt, 1948, on the way to London. And they talked about, mistreatment of women. I mean, it was just amazing stories. So there are things that you can use sport to get at that maybe somebody else might not pay any attention to. But suddenly when you say the Olympics, and then, this tells you something about gender discrimination, it's a pretty amazing story. The thing that I care, what I've been luckiest about, is that history has taught me so much, and I've been able to meet a lot of people, interview a lot of people who have shared their stories. And I think that my job, more than anything else, is to be respectful of their stories, to make sure they're not forgotten, and to make sure that ultimately we learn from their resiliency, from their pain, from their defeats, from their optimism. And that's what I'm going to try to do with this museum.
One more question? I'm going to quote you again, sorry.
Oh, it isn't.
Referring back to the statement in this article where you said, even more troubling was the fact that the majority of African Americans surveyed expressed either little interest or some level of embarrassment about slavery. I want to go to that issue because a lot of times when I have youngsters in my classes and we start talking about the issue of race, very often, not only race, but a lot of the other issues of ethnicity, any issue of minority concerns, there's a level of embarrassment at which people don't want to really address this because then they're not only that they're seen as somehow whining, complaining, being whiners, complainers. And haven't we done this already? You guys should get past this, that kind of an attitude. And that is one of the reasons I find very often youngsters not wanting to engage, because they want to be seen as even beyond the teenage level of being cool and don't want to be seen this way. But there's also, even with adults, even as a woman of color speaking here, there is that whole issue of, if you talk about this, you are complaining. How do you get people past that in a museum?
I think that there are a couple things. I think that, you're really talking differing sides of this coin, okay? And that I think that what's clear to me that on both sides of the coin, the first issue is lack of information, lack of understanding, lack of clarity. And that, let's take this question of embarrassment. Let me do that first. When I talk to a lot of students, they say, please don't talk about slavery. This is embarrassing. Our ancestors were held in bondage. But then I have them read slave narratives. And I have them see, yes, there is this amazing pain, but yet there is this amazing resiliency. And then I always frame it. I would give anything to be as strong as my slave ancestors. Really would. And that begins to turn one side of the coin. I think the other side of the coin is often when people say, haven't we discussed this, our first reaction is to get defensive instead of saying, no, we really haven't. What we've done is we have, by announcing something, doesn't mean we've discussed it. And so we think that I've heard about slavery, I've heard about that, and then we who want to talk more about it back up and get defensive. And I'm saying, no, all you've done is heard the title page. Now what I want you to do is read the book and begin to try to frame it that way. And then I think that the other thing I do is I talk a lot about I'm not interested in assessing blame. Now, culpability and responsibility is part of life. But I'm not interested in saying, you did this to this group or that. But what I'm interested is understanding why that happened and what are the implications for us today. What I've been struck by, whether it's talking to kids here or folks around the world, is, as a historian, historians talk all the time about why history matters. We talk all the time about what this means today and tomorrow. And yet we never articulate that to students, to the average citizen. And I've been doing a lot in the United Kingdom as they've been wrestling with, this is the bicentennial of the abolition of the slave trade in England. And I've done a lot of talks and a lot of programs over there. And every program, somebody raises their hand and says, this is a real interesting story, but why should I care today? And once we began to answer that question, people said, oh, okay. And there was an engagement. So in some ways, it's incumbent upon us to say why this matters today. We let people think that history really is about yesterday. And I think we have to be much more explicit as historians, as teachers, and it means we're going to have to think about, well, why does this really matter? What does this tell us about today? The example I always use was in Chicago. In Chicago, I was at a program where a teenager asked the question about, there had been an event where somebody from the south side of town, which is a predominantly African-American side, had an altercation with somebody from the north side of town, and basically said, why did this happen? And I talked about the history of settlement in Chicago, and why people live where they live, and why that happened, and then what does that tell us about today? And I remember this young kid saying, okay, I'm not sure I buy everything you've said, but I now understand that there are forces and factors that have led us to this moment. And if I can get people to see that, I'm home. I'm home. So that's how I answer that.
Well, so, Lonnie, wasn't it, I think, in one of these conferences in England that an African-British went to a country in Africa and then connected with an African-American with the same roots, and therefore made sort of history of at another level.
Right, that's right.
And the commonalities they were trying to find between each other, it was fascinating. This was an NPR story.
Right, and there is a documentary I'm going to recommend to you that's going to be out in about 2 months. There's a documentary by a woman named Katrina Brown, and it's got the worst title. It's called Back in the Deep North. But it's basically the story of a woman who discovered that her family, which was fairly well off, the roots of the family's money was in the slave trade in Bristol, Rhode Island. And so what she did is she pulled together her family in Rhode Island or in New England saying, come together, let's talk about this. And it was great. She sent out invitations to 200 members of her family, and only 9 wanted to talk about it. But that 9 was so engaged that they had conversations, and then they went to visit they had a historic house that was their home, and began to visit and understand how the slave trade shaped Bristol, Rhode Island, and Providence, Rhode Island. But then she took the 9 of them, they went to Africa. And they went to Goree Island and saw some of the slave pens, and you could imagine the issues that would come out. Oh, don't make me feel guilty. And there was this whole notion of, we didn't do anything. And then they went into the slave pen, and it was all dark, so you don't see anything. They come out and they say, we did something. And it was this real interesting moment. And then they went from there to Cuba, because they actually owned plantations in Cuba. So they went to track down some of their plantations and then came back. And then 9 months later, they all came together to talk about what this meant. And it's really, I would argue, one of the most honest, in fact, sometimes it's even painful for me to look at, honest looks at what race means in America. And one of the honest looks of saying, here's how we're shaped. Our family is shaped by it. And it's just, is it the best documentary I've ever seen? Nah. But it might be the most interesting and the most courageous. So when that shows up on PBS at the end of the year, I would recommend you all see it. It's really very powerful to me. And it's one of the few times I've seen where you could easily make the connection for people to say, okay, I get it, that in Bristol, Rhode Island, 85% of the businesses in 18th century Bristol were tied to the slave trade. And you simply just get that, he's telling you guys, well, then it does mean something to me. If my grandfather was, or my great-great-grandfather was the carpenter, oh, but his carpenter, he made the things for the ship. Or I was the sutler, or whatever it's called, well, we gave the provisions for the slave ships. It's really pretty amazing stuff. So I think that's one of the most amazing documentary. And this woman is wonderful. She's probably 30 years old, blonde, just really beautiful. And sort of when she did this, her brother said, well, why are you raising all these issues? And she said, simply because I'd like to know really about my family. I'd like to know not just what we want to talk about, I want to know what really shaped who we are. So it's really, it's just some of the most amazing things I think you can see.
Well, just as we are winding down, any last question,
Yes.
comment?
Yes.
In relation to that issue of relating what happened in America to Africa, how would the museum represent the relationship between African Americans and Africans?
Okay.
I'd like to add a comment. I took
Please.
a group of my students to a presentation by an African scholar from Howard University. Then we had a discussion in class, and most of my African American students said that they didn't feel any identity with Africa. So that's why I'm asking the question.
It's interesting. I wrote an article on my first trip to Africa, and the article was entitled "Nobody Welcomed Me Home," and it was really revealing for me to think about what I expected versus what happened. And so I think part of what I want to do is help people understand that there are ties of language and attitudes that are still strong. But I also want people to recognize that in some ways you're very, very different. What I'm curious about is I spend a lot of time talking to people from Ecuador and Paraguay of African descent, and they talk about what Africa means to them in a way that is almost more closer than what I can do. Because in some ways, in Brazil, slavery ends in 1888, so it's really, not that long ago in terms of being able to say, here's a direct African connection. So I would love to be able to help us all begin to think a little more about Africa, to understand what it means, what its ties are, and to understand where we have myths, historically and contemporary. And I think that there is so much learning for me from South Africa and many other places I've been that I'd like people to learn from that as well. But I think the challenge for us is to recognize that this is an African American institution, and that I want Africa and the diaspora to be a big part of it, but it's not going to be the central part of it. And I think the question for me is, how do you craft a museum that explores the diaspora in a different way? Most of the places that explore African diaspora are back at that notion of Africans are here too. There are Africans in Brazil, there are Africans here, how do you do it where maybe it's a more cultural look? That why is it that when I travel to Lapland, they want to talk to me about African American culture? Why is it that African culture has this influence throughout Latin America that is so strong and so persuasive? So maybe the ways to get at it is to look at it through that lens. So I don't know exactly how we're going to explore it, but I know that it's both the place that we have to explore, but it's also the place that's fraught with many issues. There are many people who have mythologized what Africa is and who we are as Africans. There are others who have completely rejected it. So I need to find that middle ground. I'm not yet sure how to do it, but I know it's more than simply a panel of maps that say the slave trade took people here, there, and everywhere. I know for sure it's more than that. Beyond that, I don't know yet.
Well, this is, I think, the beginning. You've given us so much to think about.
I'm still only at the beginning? Oh, no.
For us, this is the beginning. I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this session. I'd like to thank Christina Blackburn, who's here from the University of Utah and has been working diligently at this seminar, and on behalf of all of us, we can't thank you enough, Lonnie. And we wish you all the best and wait to help build the museum and see your dream realized.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it. My pleasure. We off?
Thanks, Willie.
Thank you very much. That was great fun, guys. Thank
We made you talk non-stop.
I know.
That's easy.
I think he's going to complain.
I never complain. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, thank you very much.
No. I just think you guys are so kind, asking hard questions. I mean, this really is the hardest thing we'll ever do. And it really is, and you know, it's everything. It's the politics, you know, it's there are people who want to give me money if I tell stories in a certain way. There are other people who want, well, you know, what you do is you lie. I don't know. You know, you say, oh, I'm going to do it that way. Cash. But I think part of it is, you know, so much of the Smithsonian and so much of what I do is about personal capital. So part of what you do is you get people engaged, you get people to trust you, you get people to believe in you, or you get people angry at you and then you feed them somebody else that they can like. But I mean, I think we have to figure out all that, and then the scholarly stuff is really hard to figure out. How do you, you know, we have this scholarly advisory group, and when I brought them together, they would fill this table, and they'd have a million ideas. Okay, guys, come on down. Let's, you know, and trying to get that done. Trying to also, you know, work within an institution that has conflicting priorities. You know, when I was here when the Indian Museum started, and that was such a priority that there were a lot of resources given to that they don't have to give to me. So there are things I have to do that the Indian Museum didn't have to do, or the Museum of American History didn't have to do. And then, you know, you layer on the fact that there are people, African Americans, who believe this is the promised land. So when I say that my staff is a diverse staff, some people get upset. Well, how come, you know, there aren't enough black curators? Well, how come you're hiring diverse people? Because this is America's story. So there are things that I've sort of said, this is the way we're going to do it, that, you know, we get beat up on, but that's okay. You know, I always tell people, when you grow up in New Jersey, you know how to run, fight, and duck.